We're continuing our survey of the biomolecules you have to know, 4 kinds. We've talked about carbohydrates, and now we're going to talk about lipids. What do you know about lipids? Well, these are the molecules that are not hydrophilic. They are hydrophobic. They don't like water. They repel water. They try to get away from water. So for the most part, these are non-polar covalent bonds involved in making these molecules. Again, we're talking about carbon and hydrogen, but not with the carbon and then hydrogen, oxygen, hydrogen 2-to-1 ratio that you have in carbohydrates. There's much less oxygen in the lipids. And this is a really pretty diverse group of chemicals. Some of them you've heard of, some of them you haven't. Fatty acids are the things that go into making fats and oils. And then you have these molecules that are pretty important on the cellular level called eicosanoids, glycerides, steroids. I bet you've heard of steroids. And then phospholipids and glycolipids. Let's take a closer look. Here is a fatty acid. This is a fatty acid, one of many, many. In this case, it's lauric acid, and it's got 12 carbons in a chain, and at one end you've got some oxygen and no oxygen to speak of on the great big long tail. So it is relatively non-polar down on that carbon and hydrogen tail. But the head part where the oxygen is, those are polar covalent bonds. So you have slightly different chemical properties on the two ends of a fairly biggish molecule. I bet you've heard of saturated acids, fatty acids, and unsaturated fatty acids. Well, in a saturated fatty acid, you have a chain of carbons, and every carbon has a couple of hydrogens hooked onto it, and every carbon has a single bond going from one to the next. So every carbon is getting 2 bonds with other carbons and 2 bonds with hydrogens. Now, if you take away one of those hydrogens, if you have a chain of carbon that is not saturated with hydrogens, then you have a carbon chain with a kink in it, as a couple of those carbons get their 4 bonds, not from another hydrogen, but from making a double bond between a couple of adjacent carbons. So, straight, kinked. And this makes a big difference. Okay, if you look at these 2 ways of being a fatty acid chain, you've got the unsaturated on the bottom and the saturated on top. Which one do you think you can stack together like cordwood and it will be stable at room temperature? Solid. The saturated fatty acids, they're straight, they stack together nicely. Unsaturated fatty acids, it's more like trying to stack a big pile of twigs instead of cordwood, and they don't pack together very nicely. These are the ones that are more likely to stay liquid at room temperature or at our homeostatic body temperatures. And that matters to the kinds of fats and oils they make. A particular kind of lipid are the triglycerides, in which they have, by a dehydration synthesis, you can attach 3 fatty acid tails to a head of polar covalently bonded glycerol groups. Okay, head, tails. Do you think you might have triglycerides in your body? Well, that is kind of a leading question, and yes, you'd be quite correct. You do. You have them all over. This is the stuff we call adipose tissue, in which cells contain a big droplet of fat. It's a wonderful energy reserve. When you can't get enough to eat, you can break down some of this fatty material to generate enough energy to keep going. It has a number of other functions in your body too. Insulation, padding, keeping your organs like your eyes in the right spot. Really emaciated people get sunken eyes and their joints hurt because they aren't padded enough, and they get chilled easily because they're not insulated. Can you have too much of a good thing? Yeah, that too. So plenty of us have a little bit of adipose tissue to spare, but I'll point this out. Fat gets a bad reputation in our culture because so many of us have too much, but it is an important part of us being human. We humans, even very thin, fit people, we have more fat on us, specifically more fat under the skin, subcutaneous fat, than even our closest relatives do. So an ape may have lots of fur. We don't. We have fat instead. And it's a big component of a perfectly normal, healthy human body. Here's another kind of fat that maybe you didn't, well, not fat, another kind of lipid that maybe you don't think of as being a lipid. But I bet you've heard of steroids. And I bet you've heard of cholesterol. Well, steroids is a word for a big group of molecules in which there are carbon rings attached to each other, 4 or 5 of them, and a number of carbon and hydrogen and to a lesser degree oxygen groups attached. We call these steroids. We call them lipids because they have some of the same properties as all the other lipids in terms of the ratio of carbon to hydrogen to oxygen, less oxygen all around, and because they are hydrophobic. But they are really pretty different from those fatty acids. No great big long chains of carbon or anything. Cholesterol, you've probably heard of. It has a bad reputation. Too much cholesterol is bad for you. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail, but I will point out that cholesterol is a big component of every one of your cells and that you would die without it. So, great stuff to have in the right place. You have a number of hormones that are derived from cholesterol and that are steroid hormones, such as the lady hormone, estrogen, and testosterone, the male hormone. Now you have other steroids also throughout your body. There are a number of them that are stress hormones that are produced by little glands that are perched on top of your kidneys, and they are also terrific anti-inflammatories. So we use the synthesized version of these natural human substances to make, for example, hydrocortisone cream. You put it on your poison ivy rash and it soothes the itching because it's an anti-inflammatory. Or maybe you've been prescribed oral steroids because of your bad back that won't stop being inflamed, or maybe you have a touch of arthritis and there may be steroid medications injected directly into the joint to soothe the inflammation. It's been extremely helpful to a lot of people. That's not the kind of steroids that you're probably thinking of. When you hear the word steroids, I bet the first thing that comes to mind is a great big muscly guy who's gone crazy. Yeah, anabolic steroids. Synthetic versions of testosterone that may be abused by athletes who take this drug in order to build up big, bulky muscles. And probably a little bit done right won't hurt you, but people do have a way of abusing these drugs, and they are not good for you. You may get the big, bulky muscles, but it may also really affect your cardiovascular system, and you can die of a heart attack pretty easily. So, not recommended. Cholesterol, you've probably heard of good cholesterol and bad cholesterol. What that really means is the particular molecules, the lipoproteins that carry cholesterol around in your bloodstream. The high density lipoproteins are carrying cholesterol back to the liver to be processed. The low density lipoproteins are carrying cholesterol away from the liver, and that has a way of getting deposited on the inside of your arteries and contributing to cardiovascular diseases. We'll talk about that later. What I want you to have is a slightly fuller and more sophisticated understanding of what steroids are. It's not just anabolic steroids that are abused by athletes. It's a large class of chemicals that include many, many biologically important substances. Okay, I see on these two representations of a molecule great big long spidery legs of carbons with hydrogens attached. Okay, fatty acids. We've seen those before. And then you got this big doodad up there like the body of a guy on stilts. And it's got red things and a blue thing, and you know, what is that? That is a phospholipid. There is an atom of the element phosphorus. That's shown in yellow, and that makes a little phosphate group in the middle of this. And then you have, so there's at one end at the top that is not fatty acid, is not lipid, is not hydrophobic. In fact, it's hydrophilic. And then you've got these fatty acid dingly-dangly legs. One's got a kink, one's straight. And those are hydrophobic. They are fatty acid chains. Okay, let me tell you about molecules like this. Take a bunch of these phospholipids, drop them in a blender, blend it up together with a bunch of water, and you get this creamy stuff, and then just leave it to set for a while. What will happen? Well, the heads of these molecules are hydrophilic. They like water. They want to face water. The tails, the long stilty legs, are hydrophobic fatty acids. They don't like water, they want to get away from water. And the hydrophilic tails all face each other, and the hydrophobic heads arrange themselves around the outside and face the water. And they do this all by themselves. They make these little balloons, we call them micelles. And you don't have to do anything to them. They just make this shape that starts to look an awful lot like a cell. Here is a cell membrane. We'll talk more about these next week. Around every cell there is a membrane. They call it a plasma membrane because it's kind of oozy-goozy. And it's made of 2 layers of phospholipids. So you see all those little rosy golf balls? Those are the phosphate heads of phospholipids, all facing outside to where there's water, all facing the inside of a cell where there's also water. And then the fatty acid tails are in between them like a sandwich, trying to get away from the water. So a phospholipid bilayer surrounds every cell in your body. And we will get back to the properties of these particular molecules, because how things go in and out of cells makes a lot of difference. Not just anything will go through the phospholipid bilayer. Few things will. A lot of things won't. Water will not casually cross that phospholipid bilayer. Yeah, it gets along fine with those phosphate heads, but it won't get past those fatty acid tails.